in listen-only mode.
Hello everyone, my name is Josh Richards. I'm the Marketing Director at Merit Solutions, and I want to first thank you all for joining us today for this webinar titled Principles and Best Practices for Validation. I think we have a great session planned today, but prior to giving control over to our presenter, Valerie King-Bailey, who's the CEO of Onshore Technology Group, I wanted to cover just a couple of housekeeping items first, I guess. And forgive me, I have a cold. First off, we want to let everyone know that this webinar is being recorded and the recording will be shared with attendees following the event. All attendees are currently in listen-only mode. However, we will invite you to submit any questions or comments using the GoToWebinar control panel, and we'll try to save some time at the end of the session for Q&A with Valerie. And then finally, today's session is the first in our series titled Leading Life Sciences to Success in a Digital Future. This series is co-sponsored by Merit Solutions and Microsoft and supported by partners like Valerie and Onshore Technology Group today. Our next session takes place on March 21st, and that's being presented by Michael Gesser, who is the Chief Financial Officer at HAP Innovations, LLC. They're a consumer health technology company with products that help track and dispense pills for patients. So Michael has been in the CFO controller role for life sciences companies for more than a decade, and I know he's been involved with a handful of ERP evaluations in the past, most recently evaluating the Microsoft Dynamics 365 platform. So on March 21st, Michael is going to share what he's learned during these projects and why he believes that the Dynamics 365 platform is a good platform for life sciences companies. After Michael's session, when we get into April, May, and the June presentations, those are more of the product demonstration sessions that we'll be getting into of the Microsoft Dynamics 365 and MaxLife 365 platforms. During these sessions, we'll be joined by presenters from Microsoft as we cover topics from financial management, manufacturing, quality, cloud security, and then Valerie will join us again at the end to discuss validating the Microsoft Azure cloud. So I think that's enough from me. I'd like to take a moment now, I guess, to introduce you to our presenter today, Valerie King-Bailey, again, the CEO of Onshore Technology Group. So in her role as CEO over the last 13 years at Onshore Technology Group, Valerie has specialized in providing independent validation and verification products and solutions, specifically to the life sciences industry. Prior to her work at Onshore, Valerie worked for leading global companies such as Abbott, QMOS, Documentum, and US Steel. And I know here at Merit, we believe Onshore really is the best validation partner out there. So without further delay, Valerie, I will go ahead and hand over presenter rights to you and let you take it from here.
All right, thank you so much, Josh, and good morning to everyone who's joined us today. Thank you so much for attending our presentation today, and the first in the series from Microsoft and Merit Solutions. I'd like to thank Merit for inviting me to speak today. Before we get started on our presentation, I just want to share a little bit with you about my background since it really does inform my talking points today to you regarding validation. As Josh mentioned, I'm the CEO of Onshore Technology Group, and Onshore is the author of the FDA validation toolkit for Microsoft Dynamics AX, NAV, and GP. I have been with several leading companies, and I've sat in your seat actually at Abbott Laboratories, where I was Director of Document Management and Quality Systems. But even at QMOS, I was Chief Marketing Officer, but again, still involved with validation. And at Documentum, although I was Director of Industry Development for Life Sciences, I developed Documentum's validation toolkit. And even while at Intergraph Corporation, I was Director of AEC, Architecture, Engineering, and Construction, but still was involved with validation. So throughout my career, even though I've been an engineer by degree, I've always been involved with validation, either for large engineering systems or life sciences systems. I'm a graduate of the UW-Wisconsin-Madison and distinguished alumni and Lifetime Achievement Award winner at the University of Wisconsin College of Engineering. So join me on LinkedIn. So let's talk about today's topics. Today what I'd like to talk about is to give you a brief introduction to independent validation and verification. I won't bore you with a lot of statistics and that, but I wanted to talk about the importance of validation and why it's now more important than ever given the environment that we are subject to in life sciences. Then I want to talk about the impact of changing technologies and talk about the impact of cloud environments and outsourcing your technology infrastructure in the cloud, mobility, and then one of the #1 threats, at least according to the U.S. federal government, cybersecurity, and how these areas impact validation. I also want to talk to you, which is the crux of my presentation today, about the current principles and best practices for validation. Validation as a practice is changing. And I want to talk about how those changes are impacting the way we validate and how the changes that we are recommending can actually help accelerate validation initiatives. And then finally, I'll share with you what I call my 7 habits of highly effective validation projects. And hopefully we'll have time for a few takeaways and questions at the end. So let's talk about validation and verification, but I really want to talk about this in the context of today's environment. To start off, let's talk about why we validate in the first place. This is good for us to establish some common ground in terms of why independent validation and verification is so important and what we should be doing. The reason we validate is very simple. We validate to establish confidence that systems are fit for purpose and, as the FDA say, perform according to its intended use. That's why we validate. This doesn't mean that we validate to ensure that software is 100% free of defects. We're really looking to see that it is suitable for production use. And the type of use that you have and risk will determine the level of due diligence that you have to do with respect to validation. I came across an interesting statistic as I was preparing for this presentation. Did you know that in the United States, $1.1 trillion in assets were impacted by software failures in 2016? That's a lot of software failures. This accentuates the need for independent validation and verification, especially in life sciences. This process is still a relevant process, and it's still a very much needed process. I get asked often sometimes, do we still need to do validation? And some people, use validation as somewhat of a tick the box type of process. It's very much needed, because if you think about the systems that we're deploying in life sciences and the criticality of those systems to your business processes, significant revenue and market impact can happen with software failures. Now, if we look worldwide, it even gets bigger. $6.2 trillion annually is affected by either software failures or defects in software. And this deals with not only the processes that are affected, but sometimes companies can actually lose market share because of high-profile failures. And we've seen some of those in the recent past. But nevertheless, the need for software validation is not decreasing, it's actually increasing. So what does this all lead us to? Validation as we know it is dead. As I said earlier in my remarks, I've been around validation for 30 years, and as a practice, it hasn't changed very much. Last year at the Institute of Validation Technology, I gave a presentation, and this is a little excerpt from the talk that I gave to a group of validation engineers. And when I shared with them that validation as we know it is dead, most of the validation engineers in the room actually agreed. Actually, last year I was Speaker of the Year at the Institute of Validation Technology. But what I was talking about is cloud computing environments are a game changer with respect to how computer systems are validated, and for many reasons. One of the key principles we're going to talk about later in validation is change control. Well, what's the issue with clouds? They change all the time. So how does one maintain the validated state? We're going to talk about that in this presentation. Also, there are real-time cybersecurity threats. So if you go back and read the regulations concerning validation, none of the regulations currently, or the FDA guidance, or the EMEA guidance for that matter, talk anything about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a clear and present danger to most companies. We have to start thinking about this when we do validation. So all validation engineers test security. Security is something that all validation engineers have had front and center. Cybersecurity is a different type of threat. It's a different type of security threat that we have to deal with. And then when we look at mobile technologies, you'll find in life sciences companies, in clinical areas, in manufacturing areas, in the IT areas, mobile technologies are prevalent. Mobile technologies are even used as medical devices these days. So how do you deal with mobile technologies and validation? And then the so-called Internet of Things. The company Intel introduced this whole principle of Internet of Things, but people are starting to put technologies into all kinds of things, if you will. And that's kind of changing the way we validate. And then, of course, most companies are looking at paperless environments. Validation engineers are even trying to do paperless validation. So with everything going green and all of these principles, validation as we know it is dead in terms of the way we did it. We just have to look at a different way of doing things. So when we look at some of the processes for validation, they're sometimes inefficient and cost-effective. One of the things that validation has a reputation of is being a little bit on the expensive side, and that's for a reason that many of us understand. There are excessive document review and approval cycle times, manual screen capture process when you're trying to capture objective evidence for validation, which, by the way, is mandatory, and then duplicate roles and responsibilities, inconsistent or non-existent practices or SOPs, if you will. Institutional silos have a significant impact, and other types of problems like this negatively impact the timeline, increase the cost, and cause what we consider non-value added work. Now, let's talk about the cloud. When you are in an on-premise environment, and this is historically what validation engineers were faced with packet software, you managed everything. So if you were a validation engineer or a validation company that's managing a validation project, you were responsible for everything from networking to storage to operating systems to the application and the data on that system. And you got to control everything that happened. Now with respect to the cloud environment, you have infrastructure as a service, which is kind of the Azure environment, if you will, platform as a service, which also is Azure, and then software as a service, which are things like Office 365, Dynamics 365, etc. A portion of that technology infrastructure is not managed by you. It's managed by your service provider. So how does that change how we validate? Well, you bet it changes how we validate, because now the service provider's role becomes front and center. Now we have to do an audit on our service provider that's a little bit deeper than what we used to do before. So the service provider is dealing with virtualization, runtime software, and that kind of thing. But if they're a software as a service, a true software as a service, they're managing everything from the platform that it sits on to all of the data and the applications that serve that. So you have to understand a couple of things. You can outsource your business capability or function, but according to the FDA, you cannot outsource accountability for information security. So what does that mean for you? That means that you have to do your due diligence to identify and address any control gaps in your cloud environment and identify any control dependencies and governance in that particular environment. Now I'm going to talk to you about that in just a second. We still have to maintain the validated state in a cloud environment. You have to know that all cloud service providers are not created equal. Some are more compliant than others. Some understand compliance more than others. So when you're selecting a cloud provider, you have to look at a couple of things. Now, here's the silver lining in the cloud. Most of today's responsible cloud providers conduct what are called Service Organization Controls, SOC. That's what that stands for, Service Organization Controls. These are independent service control reports that are conducted by the American Institute of Certified Public Accountants, or IACPA firms, and these firms actually check the controls of a cloud provider. So what does that mean for you? That means that you don't have to do your own independent cloud assessment or cloud audit. These audits are done for you. There's an SSAE 16 report, and then your SOC1, SOC2, and SOC3 reports that are out there that talk about the controls and the operating effectiveness. These AICPA firms go into a cloud provider's environment and they test not only the efficiency of the controls, but the effectiveness of the controls. The FDA loves these reports, and we recommend strongly archiving the SOC 1, SOC 2, and SOC 3 reports with your validation package. Many data centers may or may not be familiar with the unique regulatory requirements, but these SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 requirements are in alignment with some of the regulations, but not necessarily fully aligned. So what does that mean? That means that there's still a little bit of due diligence that you have to do, but it's much easier if you have these reports. Did you know that validation actually has a written standard that says how validation should be conducted? It's called the IEEE 1012 standard. This is the standard on which the FDA, when they wrote the validation guidance that we all use, this is the standard that they used. IEEE stands for the International Institute of Electronics and Electrical Engineers. They are a standards body, a global standards body that defines standards for everything. They defined the standard for validation, and the latest iteration of their standard, which is the 2016 standard, actually does address the cloud environments, and it does address a bit of cybersecurity. But one of the things I was disappointed about the standard is that it's not very specific or prescriptive in terms of that. And that's one of the needs for this presentation, and I'm actually drafting a book now where I talk about cloud computing and cybersecurity strategies. This is the standard that's used by the FDA, and it also applies to either commercial off-the-shelf software or bespoke or custom development. Now, there is a standard for managing the cloud right now. The Cloud Security Organization, CSA, if you go to www.csa.org, and if you've never visited that website, I strongly recommend that you visit it. They've established the first ever baseline for a cloud control framework specifically designed to manage the risk in the cloud. And they address challenges of persistent information, and it really provides kind of a common language, if you will, for measuring the effectiveness of the cloud. It serves as the baseline for standards. Now, when you look at the Cloud Security Alliance, they have 11 cloud control matrix domains with 98 specific controls for the cloud. So a lot of my clients ask me, is it really safe to put your information in the cloud? And my answer to them is yes. provided that your cloud provider understands the 11 domains and have verified the 98 controls. And if you look at these controls, these will sound familiar to you because in an on-premise environment, this is what we do as validation engineers to manage this. Compliance is the first one. Data governance. Facility security, how well is our data center secured? Human resources, information security, legal aspects of security, operations management, risk management, release management, and resiliency. How easy is it to bring this system back in terms of disaster recovery and so forth? This is a mandatory requirement for all validated systems, is that they be resilient and that you maintain the control. When you look at Microsoft, and one of the things that I've been, as a compliance engineer, super pleased with is Microsoft finally has put a lot of their quality information in what they call a Microsoft Trust Center. If you go to www.microsoft.com/Trust Center, this I strongly recommend that you look at. Microsoft, for Microsoft Azure, Dynamics 365, and Office 365, has put the Cloud Security Alliance assessment of their cloud control matrix, those 98 different controls. Microsoft has done all of the work for you. They have assessed their cloud environment, and they're providing for you an assessment of their cloud. But even more important than that, Microsoft also has the SOC1, SOC2, and SOC3 reports online. You can get these if you are a Microsoft client. This is super important. When I validate any of Microsoft systems, I always archive the SOC 1, 2, 3 reports as well as my cloud control matrix, which is already filled out with the system. Now, what I always recommend to my customers is please read this information. Don't just say, okay, Microsoft gave me this, archive it with the package and move on. No, please read it, because it provides for you the controls, and it tells you the effectiveness of Microsoft's controls. When I saw this website go up, I was like dancing in the streets, because this is the type of information. If you're going to trust your information to Microsoft, you really do need to read this information. This is an excellent resource. And I've gone through the cloud control matrices for several customers, and I've looked at the SOC1 and SOC2 reports. This is fantastic information. It doesn't say that you don't have to do anything else, because of course, during your validation due diligence, you still do a lot of testing. But this is an excellent starting point, and please consider it as that. This is a great starting point. And there are other cloud providers that have this too, but Microsoft has done a great job of pulling this information together. Now, let's look at cloud and cybersecurity and the way these are changing the way systems are validated today. Here's a fact of life. The Assistant Director of the FBI, Joseph Demarest, made this statement back in 2015. He said, pretty much you're going to be hacked. Not if you're going to be hacked, but he said you are going to be hacked. Just yesterday, I don't know if you read this, but a company called Cloud Pets, they make toys for children where adults can actually tape record a message, if you will, to a child, and then you give the child, you know, the tape recorded message from a loved one in the form of a pet, you know, a stuffed animal or some sort. Yesterday, they were hacked. 800,000 user accounts and 2 million voice recordings, and they also even noted that the children with the pets can actually be spied upon. This is frightening stuff, but just yesterday, the Cybersecurity Alliance actually announced that they were hacked. You'll notice that in the headlines, every single system that you could possibly think of is getting hacked. So it's not a question of if, it's a question of when. So the truth about cybersecurity is that cybersecurity threats are actually increasing. You will be hacked. They say that networks are like M&M candies, hard on the outside but soft on the inside. So we as validation engineers, we need to look at the changing threats, and we need to consider cybersecurity in the way we validate systems. Now, this totally changes because there is no, in the FDA guidance, currently as it sits today, there is no cybersecurity guideline, if you will, for how to do this. But there are industry standards out there, such as the ones that I just highlighted in CSA, that provide guidance and governance for how you deal with cybersecurity threats. So as validation engineers, we have to look at cybersecurity, and we have to protect and defend validated systems environments, but we also need to maintain data integrity throughout the life cycle of the system. So how do we do this? We do it in 3 different ways. We first conduct a risk assessment to identify the threats and vulnerabilities. We identify and prioritize these gaps. These may be gaps in procedures, policies, and controls for the validated systems, and we use CSA's 98 different controls to actually look at where our gaps are, and then we update and we conduct explicit testing in validation. So you've heard of IQ, OQ, PQ testing. We conduct explicit testing for cybersecurity now. This is a really big change in validation from what we're doing. I don't know if you've seen this, but the FDA last year in April, just about a year ago, issued new guidance for CGMP systems for data integrity. Why did they issue this guidance? Because as you're implementing things in the cloud, and as you're moving data and transitioning data or transforming data or migrating data in the cloud, the FDA is deeply concerned about data integrity and authenticity of that data as it migrates throughout its data lifecycle. So one of the things, and I strongly recommend that you Google data integrity and pull this guidance up online. This is essential now for validated systems. We need to look at data integrity, and we need to look at the data over all of the life cycles. How is this changing the way we validate? We need to, as a matter of our regression testing, check the data life cycle of data to make sure that the data integrity and authenticity is maintained over the life of the validated system and over the validated state. So in the 21st century now, we have enhanced testing. You probably have heard of installation qualification, operational qualification, performance qualification, user acceptance test, unit test. We now do something called CyQ, which is cyber security qualification. This is another type of qualification testing that we're doing to ensure that our systems are not only sound from an installation, operational, and performance and user acceptance test level, but from a cybersecurity level also. Validation as we know it is dead, as I mentioned before. So the future is really already here. It's just a matter of us embracing the changes that are happening and that are occurring because of cybersecurity, mobility, and the Internet of Things to look at a different way of validating. So let's now turn our attention to current validation and verification principles and best practices. First, we're going to look at principles. Now, before we get started, let's establish a little bit of common ground in terms of what we mean by best practices and principles. Best practices are those commercial or professional procedures that are widely accepted or prescribed as being the most effective. That's really what I mean when I say best practices. From a principles perspective, this is a fundamental truth that serves as the foundation for a system or belief or behavior, for a chain of reasoning. So there are certain principles that are fundamental truths, and where we get these truths are from institutional standards like IEEE, the FDA, organizations such as GAMP, GAMP, Good Automated Manufacturing Principles, that's where we derive these principles from. We practice something called lean validation. So when you think of lean, think of manufacturing lean principles. The whole idea of lean is to eliminate waste and increase efficiency. So when we talk about lean principles, we're talking about the elimination of wasteful processes with respect to validation, building in quality in our validation process, creating knowledge as we go along. So in our practice, we take our validation test scripts, which are detailed procedures, and we can actually use those as work instructions. So we're creating knowledge along the process, reducing costs, delivering things fast, and then automating testing. Automation testing is here now. And then we optimize those validation processes so that we reduce cycle times when we're approving documents, and we reduce the cycle times that is required to actually develop and execute test scripts. These are lean principles. So there are different types of waste in validation, and you may recognize some of these. Inadequate planning is a wasteful process. When you don't plan for validation, it's built-in inefficiencies. Testing, a lot of manual testing processes, and by the way, this is where the most significant cost increase happens. It's when we're generating test scripts manually. We have ways now that you can automate the test process and eliminate these wastes. Documentation. Manually generating documentation is so 1980s. There is an efficient, more effective way to not only generate your documents automatically, but also route, review, and approve using electronic signatures. Although electronic signatures are not mandatory, for validation, they're essential if you want to improve efficiency. And then not developing requirements, not having the ability to track defects or incidents, and poor quality processes or standard operating procedures around your system. And then when revalidation occurs, when you're trying to maintain the validated state in either a cloud environment or an on-premise environment, revalidation sometimes in the manual world requires you to rewrite your test scripts manually. This is another cost area where it's actually draining costs, and it's really non-value-added activity, if you will, at the end of the process. So what we've done at Onshore is we practice what we call lean validation. And the goal here is to ensure compliance and quality and eliminate waste in the process. We've automated a lot of validation processes. For example, using our lean principles, the requirements trace matrix is generated automatically because we use an automatic testing system. Our requirements are automatically tracked and managed within the system and automatically linked to each of the respective test scripts to ensure that automation. We take our test script development process and we've automated it. So we've done a lot to really bring this forward. So what are the 10 principles of validation that you need to be aware of? And these are my top 10 IV&V success principles. Number one, validation should be conducted independent from development. There should be financial, managerial, technical, and cost independence. And that comes out of that IEEE 1012 standard. If you read the standard, the first principle they discuss is the principle of independence. Why is that so important? The development team, for segregation of duties reasons, cannot also validate their own system. That's why you don't have Microsoft actually conducting their own validation. Microsoft systems are developed by Microsoft and independently validated by third-party companies. Risk management. When you're looking at your cloud environments or mobile environments or even on-premise environments, a written risk assessment is mandatory. How great the risk is drives the level of validation due diligence. The number one question I always get asked, how much validation is actually necessary? My simple response, it depends on risk. The riskier the system, the more validation due diligence. The less risky the system, the less validation due diligence. Change management, third principle. This applies to cloud providers as well as on-premise environments. So how do we maintain change in the cloud? In the on-premise environment, this was easy because when you're on-premise, remember, you have complete control over that environment. So you say when your patches are applied, when your releases are updated, and so forth. You govern everything. In the cloud, you don't. So how do you manage when the cloud provider is changing? Check your service level agreements. Usually service level agreements will tell you how often that cloud changes. And so we do what we call continuous testing in the cloud. We have automated tools that we have in place so that we can test without human intervention on a monthly basis, a semi-monthly basis, a bi-monthly basis. You literally can set a timer in our system and say, on March the 3rd, I would like for you to run these 300 scripts, and the system will go out and test the system. You have to test often. Now, as you can see, this is difficult to do in a manual environment, but super easy to do when you've automated the process. Change must be written for all changes. So typically, in a cloud environment, what happens is on a monthly or a bi-monthly basis or whatever interval you prefer, a change request is written for all of the changes. You get that information from the cloud environment, and then you conduct a bit of regression testing. Requirements traceability. Requirements traceability is mandatory. It's the fourth principle of IV&V. You must trace all of your user requirements to test scripts. This is mandatory as per FDA guidelines and as per GAMP. Now, there's an automated way to do this, to automate the traceability, and then there's a manual way. This happens to be my least favorite aspect of validation because for large ERP systems, for example, you have hundreds of requirements. Manually tracing each requirement to one or more test scripts, and there's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship. In other words, one test script represents one requirement. It's usually one test script represents several requirements. So it's very difficult to do this manually, but this is where automation begs to come in to optimize the process. The fifth principle is that of compliance. All of the systems that you validate have a compliance implication, whether that be GMP compliance, quality systems compliance for CAPA non-conformance, deviation management, electronic batch records, LIMS, systems, what have you. You have to understand compliance, and you have to build in compliance functionality in your validation testing. So in other words, if it is a CAPA system, you must test the CAPA process. If it is an electronic batch record system, you have to test the batch records process. If it's label control, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So you have to understand the compliance implications of your system. If that system is subject to 21 CFR Part 11, you must test Part 11 functionality as part of your validated systems. Number 6, SOP governance. This is ground zero for validation. You literally cannot validate a system without a comprehensive set of standard operating procedures that provide governance for validation. You have to have these prior to the start of validation. So you can't go ahead and validate your system and then develop the SOPs later. The SOPs must be in place prior to validation. Seventh principle, maintaining the validated state. This is essential in the cloud environment as well as on-premise. You have to strategize for success. Can you maintain the validated state in a cloud environment? Absolutely you can, but you have to strategize for that. Providing objective evidence, principle number 8. I get asked often, do we need screenshots for validation? Yes. Here's why. Because the FDA says they should be able to independently confirm that you actually not only ran the test, but the test ran successfully. In most systems, the FDA will tell you they will not accept a passed as objective evidence. So sometimes I see validation test scripts and the actual result just says passed or it says failed, as the case may be. That's not objective enough. They can't see that you actually passed the test. So objective evidence is critical, and this applies to all types of testing, IQ, OQ, PQ, PsyQ, and UAT testing as well. You have to provide objective evidence when you're testing. This is easy to do in an automated world, sometimes difficult in a manual world. Requirements management. Yes, you have to have requirements even for systems that are in the cloud. So sometimes people think, if I put something in the cloud, therefore I relieve myself of the responsibilities and the principles herein. No, you haven't. You still have to have requirements. If SOP governance is ground zero, requirements management is level 1. You literally cannot validate a system without a set of requirements, period, full stop. You must have requirements, and you have to be able to effectively track these requirements over the life cycle of the system. This is kind of a starting point for validation. And then the 10th principle is one that we practice, which is lean validation. Always strive to reduce validation waste and optimize the validation process. Automation is essential for this process. Now, let's turn our attention to some best practices for validation and lean validation processes. And remember, best practices are those generally accepted industry practices that we use throughout the validation practice. So when we look at validation, one of the best practices that you need to embrace is that of cybersecurity. Cybersecurity does matter. Consider cybersecurity, or PsyQ, when you're testing. Cybersecurity qualification is very important as you look at validation testing. I've been saying all along today, you need to automate the validation testing process. Of all the things that have been automated in the life sciences industry, validation is one of the last bastions of IT systems in life sciences that haven't been automated. I strongly recommend automation of the process. This will save you time and money. Our customers are recognizing about a 60 to 70% reduction in cost just through automation. And that's cost over the life cycle of the system, regression testing, as well as the initial validation testing. Always conduct a risk assessment. Risk drives how much validation due diligence you need. Most validation engineers think of risk in their head. When you tell them the name of the system, if it's a LIMS system or a Kappa system, they automatically think high, medium, or low in their head. Risk assessments must be documented. That's a really, really good best practice to get into. Leverage independent audits. At the beginning of my remarks, I talked about the SOC1, SOC2, and SOC3, and the SSAE 16 reports that Microsoft provides out of the box, if you will, on their Trust Center website. We archive these reports as a matter of best practice with our validation package. We do not rewrite anything that Microsoft has provided. We don't update it. We don't edit. We take the Microsoft reports as they are delivered in the Trust Center, and we archive these reports. This stipulates to the FDA that we've done our due diligence on the supplier, and then we do our normal supplier audit or self-audit on the system itself. The fifth best practice, embrace the cloud. I hope you've heard from our remarks that the cloud can be validated and should be validated, but things you need to look out for in the cloud are the provisioning methodologies. So for example, Microsoft's lifecycle services are used to provision Dynamics 365 in the cloud. Application testing and cybersecurity, or PsyQ testing, is also required in the cloud. These are best practices that you can embrace quickly and easily. Also a best practice, and if you've ever been in a validation exercise with me, I've emphasized this: minimize customizations. A lot of applications, including Microsoft applications like Dynamics, come with rich functionality built in. If you look at Merit Solutions, for example, MaxLife has a ton of rich capabilities that are already built into the application. There is no need to reinvent the wheel. I find a lot of times that a lot of customizations are not really necessary. I would strongly recommend, if you're implementing Merit Max Life or if you're implementing Dynamics or NAV or GP, look at the functionality first before you decide to customize, and always minimize customization. 7th principle, lean validation. Look beyond compliance. And many people think of validation as a mandatory thing. It's something that has to be done. And they don't really think about the implications of validation, in that validation could provide for you enhanced knowledge about your organization and about your processes, but it also can provide operational efficiencies and help you to reduce the cost over the life cycle of the system. Look beyond compliance when you're dealing with validation, and look for those cost savings and efficiencies. I've been doing validation, as I mentioned, for 30 years, and this is something that I have laser focused on in my practice over the last 10 years. How can I save customers money and increase their operational efficiencies in terms of doing this? Then, plan and strategize always. One thing you need to understand is validation is a process. Most people associate validation with only testing. Validation is way more than testing. Testing is a big part of it, but validation is a process. You need to plan and strategize, determine your code freeze, when you're going to stop developing, and how you're going to conduct your testing at the end of the day. A 9th principle, or best practice, you need to ensure independence. There's a reason why it's called independent validation and verification. Most people just shorten it and say validation, but the full name is independent validation and verification. It should be conducted independently from the development environment as a matter of practice. Actually, the FDA actually strongly recommends it in its guidance that validation be conducted independently to ensure that segregation of duties. And finally, establish a set of standard operating procedures that provide governance and would allow you to develop a repeatable validation process over time. Validation is not a one-time event. This is something that's going to have to be done repeatedly. So some of the things that we've done for requirements management is we've allowed the system to automatically track and manage requirements. In our system, the Dynamics 365 requirements and test scripts are built in the system, so you don't have to worry about those. Lean automated test script capture and documentation. We've actually built in compliance for Gantt 5 that allows you to actually capture screenshots automatically and put these into your user-definable document templates. And then you need to improve your validation IQ. Know the test script status execution, requirements coverage, risk, incident management, and project status. Develop actionable intelligence. And we have a dashboard that shows you all of that. So here are my 7 habits. The first thing you need to do is establish IV&V compliance maturity. Go from ad hoc, poorly defined, lack of automated processes to a process where you're optimizing the process and automating things throughout. So the 7 habits are: plan and document everything, understand your environment, audit your cloud suppliers, automate your validation testing, conduct a cyber assessment, develop good standard operating procedures, and ensure prior to first use that all of your internal resources are trained. So when you plan and document everything, you have to document all of these aspects here. Take the cybersecurity audit and those audits that are provided online and archive those with your validation package. Understanding your environment means that there is a big difference between validating in the cloud and validating on-premise. You have to understand that, understand the impact of the shared services, and govern yourselves accordingly. You do have to audit your cloud suppliers. Choose wisely. Use the SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 reports and audit your cloud providers. Automated testing is something that I think is the biggest takeaway from this. It's going to really help you in the long run to actually streamline and optimize your validation processes. Conduct a cybersecurity assessment and conduct what we call CyQ, or cybersecurity testing, as part of your validation test strategy. And then develop a good set of SOPs, ground zero for validation. This is the starting point. And ensure that all of your resources are trained. Last validation audit that I went through with the FDA, one of the first things they asked me for are training records for people who are accessing and using the validated system. If you do these are my 7 habits of highly effective validation projects. So some final thoughts and takeaways for your success. Number 1, you want to look at cloud mobility and cybersecurity. It's really changing the way systems are validated. You want to rethink your IV&V strategies and embrace lean. The old validation way we used to validate systems is dead. People are using automated strategies. They're not only doing IQ, OQ, PQ, and UAT, but they're doing cybersecurity qualification testing, looking at data security and cybersecurity as well as lean validation. You want to apply today's 21st century best practices to your validation practice and embrace the cloud. Can the cloud be validated? Yes, it can. There are excellent cloud providers out there that have solutions that would allow you to embrace the cloud. But you need to choose your suppliers wisely and apply the same principles and best practices. Visit Microsoft's Trust Center and visit the Cloud Security Alliance website at www.csa.org for more information and downloads that would help you in your validation practice. Thank you so much for listening today. I really appreciate it. And I'll open the floor up to questions. Josh?
Thank you very much, Valerie. We'll go ahead and open. I think we have 2 questions right now, so we'll go through those. Anyone else, if you have questions, feel free to submit them through the question tool and go to webinar. The first question we have is from Dave. He asks, with cloud applications averaging 2 releases per year, many life sciences companies don't believe they can afford or endure 2 ERP validations per year. And he's asking for your perspective on that.
Yeah, that's a great question, Dave. And one of the things that I talked about during the presentation is the reason why these people are saying that it's expensive, right? Because they're probably doing it manually in terms of validating this. Let me give you a, for instance, of a customer that I have now who's using the 21st century principles that I had. I have a customer who is an AX customer. They're an AX 2012, and they had an exact same problem that they were having. They recognize that the cloud changes, and in this particular case, the cloud service provider that they're using actually had 3 changes per year, and they said the same thing to me. Further, they had to bring in their whole supply chain group. They had a group of expert users. It's 28 people that they had to bring into a conference room every time they had to do this. Obviously, this is very disruptive to the organization and expensive to the organization. Not that they're outsourcing it. They were doing the testing themselves, but it's expensive to the organization because these people have day jobs. One of the ways to get over this is to fully automate the testing. Now, you can test on a more frequent basis under that continuous testing principle without it being so onerous. There are truths that actually happen in a cloud environment. You do have to maintain the validated state. So if your cloud is changing, the principles of validation for change control don't change. So even though it's expensive, what they have to do in a manual world, it's not so expensive in an automated world. So the customer that I'm referring to, they had 400 scripts that governed their entire regression testing process. They were able to execute the test scripts in less than a day, and the test scripts, once they ran their regression testing, it told them the areas of vulnerability. They were able to change those. So instead of this taking, 2 or 3 months to do, it took them a matter of a couple of days to do the same type of testing. The short answer, Dave, is automation is really the key to solving this problem. Do you get to, because of the fact that it's expensive, do you just get to say, well, it's too expensive, so I'm not going to do it? Unfortunately, no. You do have to keep up with these systems, and failure to do so gets back to my very first slide. $1 trillion in assets were affected by software deviations. As you well know, patches, updates, and changes to software and software infrastructure can have a negative impact on software. You still have to do this, but there's a smart way to do it, and then there's a 1980s way of doing this, which is the manual way. Automation is the key. Josh?
Great. It looks like we have one more question so far, a couple more minutes, so please feel free to submit more if you have more. This question, when you look at traditional on-premise versus cloud validation exercises, do you see a big impact on validation timelines?
Yes. Cloud validation, and this is as a general rule of thumb, cloud validation activities tend to require less due diligence than the on-premise, and here's why. If you think of that slide where I had the infrastructure, platform, and software as a service, and then on-premise, in the on-premise environment, you manage everything. So your installation qualification due diligence is actually greater in the on-premise environment than it is in the cloud. The cloud is actually provisioned by the cloud provider. So essentially, in the on-premise environment, we generally write scripts to test the qualification of the operating system going in, the Microsoft SQL database going in, Dynamics AOS server, so on and so forth. In the cloud environment, there are consistent processes and procedures to provision that environment, and the whole idea of the cloud is I can stand that environment up very quickly and very easily. So when we come in to qualify the cloud, the validation and due diligence is a little bit less because we are confirming the provisioning of the cloud as opposed to doing a step-by-step qualification. Even on the operational side, when we're doing operational and performance testing in the cloud, that is actually a little easier to do as well. Because when we're doing validation in the cloud, and especially if you're using our system, we build in a set of out-of-the-box requirements and a set of out-of-the-box test scripts that are already built into our validation master environment. You can now take those, execute once the cloud is provisioned and you have kind of a blank environment, you can actually execute those test scripts out of the box, and then if Merit Solutions or whoever your service provider comes in later and adds additional functionality to that environment, you don't have to write all of the test scripts from scratch. You can only write those test scripts, if you will, that the system provider is actually changed. So there is a bit of difference. Cybersecurity, or that SIQ qualification that I was talking about, in the cloud environment, we have to do that. But we have to do that in the cloud environment and on-premise, because even though you're on-premise, you're still subject to external hacking by cyber criminals. So whether you are on-premise or in the cloud, you still have to worry about cybersecurity. Josh?
Great. We do have a couple more questions coming in, so Val, if you can take a couple more minutes, we can keep going for anyone that wants to stay on. So Tony's asking, what should the sponsors do for IQ, for example, for cloud environment? Aside from vendor audits, is it acceptable to accept reporting of IQ activities from the vendor?
Yes. Generally speaking, what we do is, excuse me, we conduct our supplier qualification from the cloud provider. We pull the SOC 1, SOC 2, SOC 3 reports or any other independent audit reports that the cloud provider may have. But as a sponsor, you are responsible for confirming that that environment is sound and stable. So what we recommend that sponsors do is to draft a set of installation qualification scripts that test the areas most vulnerable in the system. There are some standard things when you're installing software that are kind of standard for any installation, for example, the operating system and that. What we're looking for are vulnerabilities in terms of points of intersection of different software applications that may be integrated with whatever your application is. We're looking for any issues that may impact the performance of that. I've seen cloud environments where batch jobs have been run in that cloud environment, and the batch jobs are significantly producing a performance hit in that environment. So we need to make sure that with a specific live load on the system that we are not getting performance or installation qualification issues concerning those systems that are integrated. That's really what the sponsor is responsible for. Installation qualification, just one more point to that, it's designed to ensure that the installation is sound and that the installation occurs in a consistent, repeatable manner. That is the bottom line due diligence that a sponsor needs to do. Josh?
Great. So I think Dave has a follow-up. So first off, he wanted to thank you for your initial answer. I think you answered part one of his question, does your company develop the automated test scripts? But part two of this is, or who do you think should develop the documentation or test scripts given each customer's environment is unique?
Yeah, generally speaking, each customer has either an internal or an external validation team that develops the test scripts. Test scripts are an art, not a science. These should be developed by people who are knowledgeable about writing validation test scripts. And here is something that is very, very important. Generally speaking, novices only test the positive case of, when they're developing test scripts. Validation engineers who are experienced are learn to write test scripts that are designed to reveal issues. So as validation engineers, our job is to identify issues with the system. So literally we try to break it if we can. So that means going well beyond the positive case. So if we take Dynamics AX, for example, if we're writing a test script for production order processing, the positive case is select new, create a production order, and take it all the way to report as finished. That's the positive case. But should I be able to change a bill of material in the middle of that process? Do I have the ability to do that? Should I be able to add more than the active ingredient? That would be a big no-no in terms of a pharmaceutical company. Does the system allow me to do that? Or can I do any other things to the system that may impact regulatory compliance or may constitute a breach of compliance or system security in any way? Those are things that validation engineers test. Who should do these? Validation engineers should do the drafting of the testing, and they should be writing the test scripts.
All right, great. I don't see any more questions in the queue right now, so I will go ahead and end this meeting. Everyone, thank you for your time today. We will share the recording of this following the session, and we'll post it online. Valerie, thank you very much for your time today.
Thank you, and thanks to everyone. Have a very pleasant day.
All right, bye now.
Bye-bye.